But it's something that just comes up over and over again. And that is the testimony about Jesus. Jesus frequently says, this isn't me. This isn't just my testimony. God provides the testimony about me. Scripture provides testimony about me. And in chapter 1, we see that John the Baptist provides testimony about Jesus. So that's important. The claim we're going to see today, maybe, if we get there, is one that's more amazing than any of those. And that's in the conversation toward the end of John 8, when he's talking about Abraham. But before we get there, I want to do something a little bit different. And I was thinking about how to do this exactly, but the next passage we talk about that actually begins at the very end, the very last verse of chapter 7, but goes through chapter 8, verse 11, is one of the biggest textual difficulties in the entire New Testament. And so I have decided to take a few minutes and talk about textual criticism. I'm sure now you're just so excited you can barely contain yourself. I mean, what better thing to talk about a little after 9 o'clock than textual criticism? But no, in all seriousness, I think that this is one of those things that I know as a teacher, and I'm sure Josh can relate to this, JP probably can too. It's one of those things that comes up from time to time, and it's important, and there's probably a lot of confusion about it, but we have such a limited amount of time to talk about things, it's hard to know when to bring it up. Well, I think now is a good time because, as I said, there's not quite another passage of text like this in the New Testament. So let's briefly, I'll try to make this brief, talk about textual criticism. Well, what is it? I mean, what are we even talking about? Well, we need to understand that what we have in terms of our manuscripts for New Testament books are copies of copies of copies on a certain time into the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Why is that not in the text? And it's because the earliest and best manuscripts don't have verse 4. So at a certain point in the... No?
You can't judge anybody because he sinned as well. But he starts off when they kept questioning him.
Yep.
He's dealing with it for people.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Yeah.
So for Jesus to say to not sin again or sin no more would mean that he had judged that she had sinned.
Oh, yeah. Right.
So I kind of draw a difference between judging and condemning.
Yeah.
I don't condemn you. I'm not going to stone you to death.
Right.
It doesn't mean you have done something wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some transition there from the law books where you get immediate judgment, you get immediate condemnation versus now there's forgiveness and transition into that into the
Right, and that's the other aspect to this that I think makes it interesting. By the letter of the law, was she supposed to be stoned? Anybody know?
Well, I think about the side of it is that the man who was also, who also sinned, was not even mentioned.
Right.
And I think that Jesus would want us to know that he had sinned also.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think, there's pretty good reason for that probably. It's a patriarchal society. I think that's the easiest way to answer that. Why isn't he mentioned? Because, again, it's a patriarchal society. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. I think Jesus would want us to know that as well. All right? So, even though, I'll say it this way, even though this passage is certainly different than other passages in John, one of the themes that still comes across, of course, is just how shocking Jesus was. And we're going to see one of the most shocking passages in the entire gospel here in just a minute, right? But for him to say to these Jewish leaders, what do you think you're doing? If you guys are sinless, all right, go ahead. I mean, what an incredible thing to say. It's like, who did he think he was, right? I mean, that would be maybe the response. Who does he think he is? Okay? Anything else about this? Yeah.
I think it's interesting, when Jesus says sin no more, I don't think he means that literally, because he understands
Oh, yeah.
this woman is going to sin again. But he's saying with those words, don't let sin overtake you or be a pattern in your life.
Right.
And I think Eric Sanders preached a lesson a couple of months ago, if my memory is correct, and he kind of related to that, the fact that we all do sin, and we're going to sin, but we're not constantly
Yep.
choosing to sin, and there's a difference. And
Right.
our effort should be to live as close as we can to what we see taught by Jesus and in Word, but understanding we're going to make mistakes,
Yep.
but we're not going to choose to constantly live in a state of rejecting God.
Right. Yeah, and I think 1 John addresses this very well. Because remember, at the beginning of 1 John, if you say you have no sin, what? What does the text say? You're a liar. No, you sin. I sin, right? But what John goes on to say in 1 John is, that's not characteristic of your life. That doesn't define who you are. What defines who you are is your allegiance to Jesus. Yes, occasionally you will sin, but they will be anomalies, which I think is kind of what you're saying. And that's absolutely correct, right? Yeah.
In the law of Moses, you didn't have to have a lifetime of sinlessness to participate in a legal execution.
Right.
But
Right.
if you were participating in some way where you were part of it, then you clearly could not righteously.
Right. Right, exactly. That's a good point. And I think that makes what Jesus says here even more shocking. So, yeah, I think that's a very good point. All right, so Jesus continues to talk about judging here, but he changes it, okay? And the Pharisees, back in verse 13, he says, here you are appearing as your own witness, because Jesus had just said, I'm the light of the world, as he said before. And they said, here you go, you're giving your own witness. Again, remember how important witness or testimony is in the gospel. And he says, the Pharisees say, if you're your own witness, your testimony is invalid, because you're saying this about yourself. But Jesus says, you judge by human standards, I judge no one. And in verse 14, he says, I know where I'm from. And again, that sort of notion of origin is important, as we've seen before. What does he say when he says, I judge no one? And then he goes on to say, yet even if I do judge, my judgment is valid. For it's not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. Why does he say, I judge no one? And again, remember how John says things. And that is, it's not always explicit. And really, I guess I should say here, Jesus doesn't say exactly what we might expect him to say. So is Jesus saying, I never judge at any point? No. I think what he's saying is, I judge no one by human judgment. I think that's what he's getting at here. He says, because the Father judges alongside of me. In your law, it's written that the testimony of two witnesses is valid. I testify on my own behalf, and the Father who sent me testifies on my behalf. So it's interesting that Jesus doesn't really back down from the fact that he does give his own testimony. But he says that testimony is important because I'm from God. So it's valid. And they say, where is your Father? And Jesus answered, you know neither me nor my Father. In verse 19, we have another example of a misunderstanding. When Jesus says Father, and notice in this translation, Father is capitalized, which means it's clearly talking about God. But the Jewish leaders didn't hear the capitalization, right? They didn't get that. So presumably they think he's talking about his earthly father. But Jesus says, you know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. And no one arrested him. He's speaking this in the treasury of the temple. And it says, because his hour had not yet come. All right. So here we have this dynamic. We see this in the book of Acts, I think more clearly. But you got this dynamic between God's providence with reference to Jesus' death, but also human action, or in this case, inaction, right? And how does that work? I don't know, but it did. So you've got these human leaders who decide not to arrest Jesus, but that's also according to the providence of God. So Jesus continues, and he says, I'm going away. And he says, where I'm going, you cannot come. They think he's going to kill himself. It's an incredible thing to contemplate. And then Jesus continues to talk about how that he is from above, they're from below, and he makes this distinction between earth and heaven. And it's probably a lot more insulting to them than they even realize. And then verse 31, Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him. So again, remember something I talked about in the introductory class, and that is that some people have looked at the Gospel of John and they said, well, it's kind of anti-Semitic because the bad guys are the Jews, right? But if you read carefully, that's not what John means. It's not like all Jewish people. No, there are Jews who believe in Jesus. And Jesus says, if you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. There is one of those most well-known passages, or phrases rather. People know this and quote it, and they don't even realize they're quoting Jesus, right? I mean, it's so popular. What does it mean here, though? Well, let's keep reading. They, the Jewish leaders presumably, or the Jews who believed in him, were descendants of Abraham, have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free? We read verse 33 and we say, how can they say that? What do they mean? They've never been slaves to anyone. Who's over them right at this moment? The Romans. Who was over them before the Romans? Well, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and on, right? What on earth are they talking about? Well, I would assume that, and I think the hint is in verse 34. He says, I tell you, everyone who commits a sin is a slave to sin. And it's not necessarily political slavery that they're talking about. Okay? We have other Jewish texts which speak to this idea. First one is from the Mishnah. And remember again, the Mishnah is from 200 AD. So it is later. But this is so close, it's hard to think that at least a tradition like this isn't behind what Jesus is talking about. Rabbi Akiva was a well-known, well-respected rabbi, said, even with regard to the poor among the Jewish people, they are viewed as though they were freemen who lost their property and were impoverished. And their humiliation is calculated according to this status, as they are the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and are all of prominent lineage. So what Akiva was saying is, even the poor among Israel can't be viewed as under slavery. So, and notice he connects it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This, later on, this tradition develops that the merits of the patriarchs account for atonement. And so this gets built in to the Day of Atonement ceremonies. Obviously, that's not in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, but it is later on. So that, again, the connection of freedom and Abraham here, I mean, it's so close, it's hard to think that it's not something similar behind what Jesus or what the Jews that Jesus is talking to think. Philo has a little bit different idea, and I think we would completely agree with what he's saying here. He says, for in actual fact, that person alone is free who has God for his or her leader. Indeed, in my opinion, that person is even the ruler of others and has all the affairs of the earth committed to him, being, as it were, the viceroy of a great king, the moral lieutenant of an immortal sovereign. So he says, no one can truly be a slave if they has God as their leader, right? And of course, so we've got this discussion of truth and freedom here. So I don't think it's political freedom. So what the Jews are saying is, we are not under any kind of slavery, whether they're talking about personal slavery or whether they're talking about in some moral or spiritual sense. They're not slaves. That's what he's saying. Okay, he says the slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The son has a place there forever. He's talking about here, of course, the rules under Roman law for slavery. They could be manumitted. They could leave the house, right? That's what he's talking about. But if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you're descendants of Abraham, yet you look for an opportunity to kill me because there's no place in you for my word. I declare that I've seen in the Father's presence. As for you, you should do what you've heard from the Father. Who's he talking to here? It's a bit of a difficult question, right? Because it says in verse 31 that he's talking to the Jews who believe in him. But then verse 33 just says they. Well, what's the nearest referent? It's these Jews who believe in Jesus. But some of the things he says here may be a little bit surprising. Maybe they're somewhat superficial disciples, or maybe he's talking to the Jewish leaders again. It's not entirely clear. All right, so we've got this discussion of freedom. We've got it discussed as freedom from sin, which is something that we know from other passages in the New Testament. Okay, so they said Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing what Abraham did. But now you're trying to kill me, a man who's told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are doing what your father does. And so they claim Abrahamic lineage. And Jesus says, or he will say, that's not really your father. They said, we're not illegitimate children. We have one father, God himself. And Jesus says, if God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God, and now I'm here. I did not come on my own, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? Is it because you cannot accept, it is because you cannot accept my word. Let's stop here. Because one question that could easily come up is, why aren't they accepting Jesus? Why aren't they accepting his word? Verse 43. What is it about Jesus, or rather, what is it about themselves that prevent them from committing themselves to Jesus? What is it? Anybody know? In what sense? Spiritually disconnected. Yeah, I think you're right. In what sense, though?
I think that knowing God and being with God.
Okay, right? That seems to be a problem for sure. But what was it specifically about Jesus that maybe led to them being, as you said, spiritually disconnected, but they certainly aren't aware of it? What is it about Jesus that makes these people not believe that he's from God? I think there's a very important principle here, a practical principle. I think you're very close. What were you going to say? Yep, exactly.
Not with what Scripture says, but what they in their mind envision.
Right?
The king.
Yep, exactly. I think that's very close to what you were saying, right? It's their expectation. And I want to say something about that. Okay, so what is one expectation? That the Messiah would be a military leader, overthrow the Romans. Yes. But there's also another expectation we don't talk as much about, but it was also there. And that is that Jesus would create that the Messiah would create this utopian-like existence where everything's great. It's like the Garden of Eden again. Well, did Jesus do either one of those things? No, he didn't. So what would they have to, and here's the practical part, I think. What would they have to do to believe in Jesus? Change their expectations. Humble themselves and say, you know what, maybe I'm wrong about this. Let's just accept Jesus for who he is, and let's accept the Messiah for who he is. The practical part is, I think people have a problem with Christianity a lot of times, and people fall away a lot of times because they have the wrong expectation. If you have the expectation that everybody in this building, everybody that's a member of this congregation is perfect, and they're never going to let you down, you got the wrong expectation. If you have the expectation that somebody close to you in this congregation will never do anything to hurt you, you probably got the wrong expectation. Now, I know it's not quite the same, but it's close. It's all about expectation. And so really, what it boils down to is what it boiled down to for them. Are we going to accept Jesus for who he is? Do we have any problems with how Jesus conducts the governance of the universe? Well, you might say, well, for starters, how about COVID, right? I mean, why is this still around? Why are we still having to deal with this? People are still sick. They're still getting sick. We know people in the congregation that are sick. Why is that? If our expectation is the universe should never have anything like that, we're going to be disappointed. Do you think people in the last couple of years have been spiritually disappointed? Probably. But again, if that's our expectation, is that correct? I mean, does the Bible say the universe is going to be exactly what you think it is? No. Never says that. I mean, if you have a passage in mind, let me know, because I don't know where it is. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think I am, but maybe I am. I certainly can be, right? But I don't think I am about this. Okay, so I think that is a huge topic that we need to think more about. It's easy to read this and say, man, can you believe how obstinate these people are? We know people do the same thing, right? It's because you cannot accept my word. Then he says, actually, your father's not Abraham. Your father's not God, it's the devil. How happy do you think they'll be at this point? What are you talking about? You choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there's no truth in him. What does it mean that he's a murderer from the beginning? Anybody know what that might mean? Yeah.
Could it be referring to like one of the first major sins, like how Cain killed his brother Abel in the beginning, and that was the devil?
Excellent. I think that's right. And there are traditions which say that Cain was actually, in a manner of speaking, offspring of the devil. And so he killed his brother because of Satan. Even though in Genesis 4, it doesn't explicitly say that. I mean, he's there in Genesis 3, right? So it's not, I don't think it's terribly far-fetched to think that's exactly what happened. I think that's the answer, right? He's a murderer from the beginning. And does not stand in the truth. There's no truth in him. He's a liar. Of course, we see that in Genesis 3. He speaks according to his own nature. He's the father of lies. It's almost like he can't even help it. He's such a liar, right? That's the idea. Okay, so all this sets up this grand claim that Jesus makes before Abraham was I am. And we'll have to wait and talk about that on Wednesday. All right? Thank you.